You've asked a really important question, one that gets right to the heart of how we understand God's actions in the Old Testament. Let's dig in, focusing on Exodus 34 and the concept of God driving out other tribes. First, how do we know the work of God in Exodus 34? Well, Exodus 34, like much of the Bible, reveals God's work in several ways. One key way is through direct statements by God in Exodus 34. God speaks directly to Moses, declaring his name, his character, and his intentions. This is a primary way we learn about God's work. For example, God proclaims his attributes of being merciful, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. You can find that in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, God's work is also shown through God's actions. God's actions in Exodus 34 and the surrounding narrative demonstrate his work. This includes renewing the covenant. After the Israelites broke the first covenant by worshiping the golden calf, God initiates the renewal of the covenant with Moses. That's in Exodus 34, verses 1 through 4 and verse 10. This act of grace and faithfulness is a key part of God's work. Another action is giving the commandments. God provides the 10 Commandments, or a restatement of them, as the foundation of the covenant relationship. That's in Exodus 34, verse 28. This giving of the law is part of God's work of revealing his will and guiding his people. We also see promises of blessing and judgment. God promises to drive out the Canaanite nations and give the land to Israel, but also warns against idolatry and intermarriage with those nations. That's in Exodus 34, verses 11 through 16. This reveals God's work of both blessing his people and bringing judgment upon those who oppose his purposes. Another way we understand God's work is through Moses' response. Moses' reaction to God's revelation also helps us understand God's work. Moses worships God, acknowledging his holiness and pleading for his presence to go with Israel. You can find that in Exodus 34, verses 8 and 9. Finally, we learn about God's work through theological interpretation. Throughout the rest of the Bible, the events of Exodus 34 are interpreted and understood in light of God's overall character and plan of salvation. This ongoing theological reflection helps us to grasp the deeper meaning of God's work. Now, let's move on to the second part of your question. What does God is driving out other tribes mean? This is a complex and often troubling aspect of the Old Testament narrative. Here's what it means in its historical context and some important theological considerations. First, let's look at the historical context. The Canaanite nations, the other tribes referred to in Exodus 34, verse 11, and elsewhere were the Canaanite nations living in the land that God promised to give to Abraham's descendants. These nations are often portrayed as morally corrupt and practicing idolatrous and abhorrent practices. Another part of the historical context is the conquest of Canaan. The Old Testament describes the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua. This involved battles and the displacement or destruction of the Canaanite inhabitants. Finally, we have God's sovereignty, the idea of God driving out these tribes emphasizes his sovereign authority over all nations and his power to direct the course of history.